It's probably not surprising to hear that just like the inequality of wealth distribution in the United States, global inequality and stratification of wealth are concentrated within certain nations and among certain people. By global stratification, I mean the unequal distribution of resources between nations, usually looking at the differences not just between, but also within nations. In this unit, we're going to aim to answer three questions. One, how do we know what we know about global inequality, or how do we get data about the entire world? What do we know about global inequality, or what is the current or recent state of affairs? And three, how do we explain global inequality? What historical background and theory is used to explain global inequality, and why should we care? So let's get started with number one. So comparisons of income or wealth among the richest 10% versus the poorest 10% of the global population are the most basic starting points for comparing nations. But these measures are really one-dimensional and focus only on income and dollar amounts. The UNDP offers one of those measures. The UNDP is the United Nations Development Program that gives a human development report each year. And one element of that human development report is the HDI, or the Human Development Index. And that focuses on three variables. One, health. The measure here that's usually used is life expectancy at birth. So depending on the year that you're born and what your biological assigned sex is, this is how long an individual can expect to live. This differs depending on what nation you're in. The measure typically reflects your diet and health practices that extend longevity. And the death of a child has a huge impact on lowering that life expectancy average. You might not be surprised that the nation that has the longest life expectancy is Japan, with 83 years. And I can tell you from experience, the Japanese do live for a very long time. The next measure is knowledge or education. Here we're usually looking at years of schooling, so how long on average a person has exposure to formal education. And it's not about quality of schooling or anything like that, so you got to take it with a grain of salt. It's typically average years of schooling of the adult population, right? So we're not looking at somebody who's like 12 years old, but usually those who are 25 years and over and can be expected to have finished what we generally consider to be a complete primary and secondary education. And it also can include projected measures of educational levels based on current enrollments of children. Another global measure for education is also literacy rates. So what proportion of the population is literate and can read? And then finally, income. So the measure of income that's being used for the HDI is the GNI, or the gross national income per capita. And so that's basically what is the average or the mean income per person in that nation. And another measure that goes into this is the PPP, or the purchasing power parity exchange rate. So how far does the currency or a dollar go? So for example, if a Big Mac is $3 in London and $6 in California, this would suggest a PPP, or exchange rate, of £1 to $2. And it kind of helps us make sense of the GNI power for that nation. So how far can that gross national income go in providing for a person's necessities and quality of life? So the next measure for global inequality is the Gini coefficient or index. And we talked about this before in our stratification chapter, but we were mainly focusing on the United States. Just as a refresher, the Gini coefficient measures inequality on a scale from 0 to 1, where higher values indicate higher inequality. And this can sometimes be shown as a percentage from 0 to 100%. And that's when it's called the Gini index. So a value that's closer to 0 indicates perfect equality, where every household in that nation has the same income. However, a value that's closer to 1 for the coefficient or 100% for the index indicates perfect inequality, where in that entire nation, one person receives all of the income and everyone else receives nothing. And the final measure we're going to talk about today is the international poverty line. And this one's pretty simple. Basically, there is a line or a limit that divides the global population between poor and not poor. And it's really oversimplified to even say that, because there are actually layers beyond this line of poverty. So I guess the absolute level is $2.15 per person per day. And so this line measures the value of goods needed to sustain one adult in the global population. And so that's not about how much money you spend in a day, but it's how much you consume in a day. How much you eat, how much energy you use, how much housing, clothing, water, things like that. And so if that person is only able to gather $2.15 per day or less, then they're below the international poverty line. And then we look at the share of the population within the nation, and we compare across nations as well. So I do want to point out that none of these measures actually paint a full picture, that there are so many other elements that can be difficult to measure, that can also intensify global inequality. And so even though we do have different indices and measurements, none of them can capture everything. So things that aren't included in the ones we just looked at are sexual orientation inequities, or racial and ethnic inequities, particularly looking at global anti-Blackness, or gender inequity. When we get to our global gender stratification chapter, we'll actually look at the Global Gender Gap report provided by the World Economic Forum, and that will actually give us some insight into what that stratification looks like for gender. But again, none of these are perfect measures. It's all very complex. So while we need some language to discuss comparisons and relationships among nations, much of what we have to work with is pretty ethnocentric. Usually we start with Cold War terminology because that's when we actually saw the development of this stratification and ranking system of nations based on their economy and technology. So first world nations were the wealthiest and most capitalistic nations. Second world nations were aspiring to be first world nations. And third and fourth world nations were the poorest and most underdeveloped nations. Fourth world specifically is not always used, but it's meant to characterize those nations that were the most oppressed and most disenfranchised, with large populations of homeless, indigenous, and imprisoned people. Development lingo assumes that nations all want to follow this development path, like Western type nations and markets and economies, that this sort of advancement in technology and economy is the ultimate goal. Simply, developed nations are the most industrialized or post-industrial nations. Developing nations are industrializing, often because they're receiving that former industry from these post-industrialized developed nations. And then you have the undeveloped or underdeveloped nations, which are primarily non-industrial. With the World Bank Economic Classification System, here we're looking at these ranks of income. And so you have high income nations, you have low middle income nations, and high middle income nations, and then you have low income nations. For high-income nations, they will have at least a GNI of $12,536 per capita. And remember, this is looking at income, not wealth. But yes, you might be thinking like, wait, I have more than that, or I'm right around that amount. Yeah, so it doesn't take much to be considered a high-income nation, and that should just show you how much poverty there is. High-income nations are not problem-free. They face some major issues like capital flight, the movement of capital from the United States or other core nations to other nations. For the US in particular, our high consumption lifestyles make it really hard to fight capital flight because we want cheap crap. Go take a look at how much televisions cost today versus what they cost a decade or two ago. They also deal with deindustrialization or the loss of jobs as a result of that capital flight. So high mid-income nations have a GNI between $4,046 to $12,535, like Argentina, Mexico, and China. And then low mid-income nations have a GNI between $1,036 to $4,045. And so there is a really big range there for the middle income nations, similar to the middle class in the United States. One of the issues of many that middle income nations deal with is debt accumulation. They typically have resisted being low income nations because they borrow money from other nations and having to pay back those loans with these high interest rates and very restrictive programs can actually push them towards becoming low income nations. And so that's a huge threat. If you look at the module about the World Bank and IMF, you'll see some examples about how those two international organizations have been involved in the positions of the middle income nations. And in particular, this is a big issue for Latin and Central America and East Asia. And then finally, we have low income nations that have a GNI below $1,035, like Yemen and Afghanistan. And the biggest issues for these nations are obvious. They have excessive poverty and they have a high rate of feminization of poverty. And they also have big risks of conflict as well.